Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The eviction notice came on a Wednesday morning in February 2022, and I'll admit right now that I deserved it. I was working as a line cook at a diner downtown, barely making enough to cover my expenses, and I'd been late on rent for 3 months straight. My landlord, Mr. Garrison, was this stocky guy in his 60s who always wore the same faded blue polo shirt and khakis whenever he came by the building. He had this way of knocking on your door that made you feel like a kid in trouble. 3 heavy raps, then silence while he waited. That morning when I opened the door, he didn't even make eye contact, just handed me the paper and told me I had 30 days to get out. The smell of his cologne, something sharp and medicinal, filled my doorway even after he'd walked away down the hall with his slight limp from an old construction injury he'd mentioned once. I spent the next 2 weeks packing my stuff and looking for a new place, but the anger just kept building inside me. Every box I taped shut felt like another insult, another reminder that Garrison couldn't cut me some slack, even though I'd been a decent tenant for 2 years before falling behind. The apartment I found was smaller, darker, with water stains on the ceiling and a radiator that clanged like someone was hitting it with a wrench every hour. The night before I had to be out, I went to the hardware store and bought a few things. Nothing suspicious on their own, just some caulk, a putty knife, and rubber gloves. Then I stopped by the grocery store and picked up some fish, the cheapest cuts they had, along with milk and eggs. I told myself I was just going to leave a little surprise for Garrison, something that would cost him money to fix, make him regret not working with me on the rent situation. What I did that night still makes me cringe when I think about it, but at the time it felt justified, like balancing the scales somehow. I waited until around 2 a.m. when the building was dead quiet, just the occasional car passing on the street below. Using the putty knife, I carefully removed sections of baseboard in the bedroom and living room, creating small gaps between the wall and floor. The wood came away easier than I expected, making these soft cracking sounds that seemed way too loud in the empty apartment. I stuffed pieces of raw fish deep into those gaps, pushing them as far back as I could with a coat hanger I'd straightened out. The smell was already getting to me, that thick oceanic stench that sticks to your fingers. In the bathroom, I poured milk behind the toilet tank and cracked eggs inside the ventilation grate. The yolks broke on impact, making this wet splashing sound that almost made me gag. The worst part was putting everything back to look normal. I used the caulk to seal up the baseboards, making sure the lines were clean and straight, then wiped everything down with bleach to kill the immediate smell. My knees were sore from kneeling on the hardwood, and I kept checking my phone, paranoid that someone would hear me and come investigate. By the time I finished, it was almost 5 a.m., and the apartment looked exactly like it had before, maybe even cleaner. I loaded my last boxes into my beat-up Ford Ranger and drove to my new place on the other side of town, telling myself that in a week or two, when the smell started, Garrison would have to tear apart the walls to find the source. It would cost him thousands, maybe teach him some empathy for the next struggling tenant. I even laughed about it that first night in my new apartment, imagining his face when he realized what I'd done. Everything was fine for about 2 weeks. I'd started a new job at a warehouse, better pay and more regular hours, and I was actually feeling good about the fresh start. My new apartment wasn't much, but it was mine, and I'd even bought a couple of plants to brighten up the windowsill that looked out onto the alley. Then on a Monday afternoon, I came home from my shift and found a white envelope slipped under my door. No postmark, no return address, just my first name written in neat block letters with a black pen. Inside was a single piece of paper with one line typed in the center. "I know what you did to apartment 4B. My mouth went completely dry. Nobody knew about that except me. I hadn't told anyone, not even my buddy Craig who helped me move. I stood there in my doorway for probably 5 minutes, just staring at the paper, trying to convince myself it was about something else, maybe a coincidence. The next day, There was another envelope. This time it contained a photograph, me, carrying boxes out of Garrison's building at 5:17 a.m. according to the timestamp in the corner. The photo was taken from across the street, but you could clearly see my face, illuminated by the streetlight. Someone had been watching that morning, had seen me leave after what I'd done. The photo had the same kind of paper attached, this time with the message, "The smell started yesterday. Mr. Garrison is very upset." I immediately thought it had to be Garrison himself trying to scare me. But that didn't make sense. He didn't know my new address. I'd made sure not to leave any forwarding information. Plus, the writing, the way the message was worded, it didn't sound like him. Garrison was direct, blunt. These notes felt different, calculated, like someone enjoying themselves. That night, the knocking started. 3 taps on my door at exactly 11:47 p.m. I know because I was watching Netflix and paused it to check the time. When I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. Just the flickering fluorescent light making everything look greenish and sick. I opened the door with the chain still on and peered out. Nothing. But there was another envelope on the floor, and this time my full name was written on it, middle initial and all. Inside were 3 more photos. Me at the hardware store buying the supplies, me at the grocery store with the fish clearly visible in my basket, and me kneeling by the baseboard in Garrison's apartment. That last one made my legs go weak. Someone had been inside the apartment with me that night, or had cameras, or something. The angle was from the doorway to the bedroom, like someone standing there watching me work. There was no message this time, just the photos. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my couch with a baseball bat across my lap and every light in the apartment on, jumping at every sound from the street or the neighbors. Around 3 a.m. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside my door. I held my breath, gripping the bat so tight my palms were sweating, waiting for another knock. Instead, I heard this soft scratching sound, like someone running their fingernails across the wood. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. The footsteps moved away, but I heard them pause at the stairwell, and I swear I heard someone laughing, this quiet, breathy sound that made my scalp prickle. When the sun finally came up, I found another photo slipped under the door. This one was of me sleeping on my couch from 2 nights ago, taken through my living room window. Someone had been watching me before I even got the first note. I called in sick to work and spent the morning trying to figure out who was doing this. I even drove past Garrison's building, parking across the street where the first photo had been taken. The apartment windows for 4B were open, and I could see workers in white hazmat suits moving around inside. A restoration company van was parked out front. Clean Tech Restoration Services, with a phone number I didn't recognize. I sat there for 20 minutes watching, when someone tapped on my passenger window. It was a woman, probably mid-30s, wearing a black pea coat despite the warm weather. She had this unnaturally pale complexion and dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun that made her face look stretched. She smiled at me through the glass and held up a manila folder with my name written on it. I locked the doors immediately, but she just stood there, still smiling, tapping the folder against the window. She finally spoke, her voice muffled but clear enough through the glass. "Drive home, check your bathroom mirror, then come back here at midnight if you want this to stop." She dropped the folder on the hood of my truck and walked away, disappearing around the corner before I could even process what had happened. Inside the folder were receipts. Every single thing I'd bought for my vandalism plan, time-stamped and highlighted. But there were other receipts too, ones I didn't recognize. Industrial cleaning supplies, surveillance equipment, and strangest of all, a receipt for a storage unit rental that started the day after I'd moved out. The unit was registered in my name, paid for with a credit card I didn't own. My signature was on the contract, but I'd never signed it. At the bottom of the stack was a single key with a tag reading Unit 47 inches and an address for a storage facility about 10 minutes from my new apartment. I drove home with shaking legs, barely able to focus on the road. In my bathroom, written on the mirror in what looked like soap, was a message. "You're not the only one who can hide things in walls." I ran my fingers over the letters, and they smeared, definitely soap, fresh enough that it was still slightly damp. That meant someone had been in my apartment while I was out, maybe an hour ago at most. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox and started checking the walls, tapping and listening for hollow spots. In the bedroom, behind where my dresser usually stood, I found a section that sounded different. Using the claw end of the hammer, I pried at the drywall until a chunk came away. The smell hit me immediately, the same rotting fish stench I'd left for Garrison, but mixed with something else, something chemical and sharp. Inside the wall was a plastic bag, and through the clear material I could see photos, dozens of them. Not of me, but of other people, all taken while they were sleeping, eating, walking to their cars. At the bottom of the bag was a driver's license with the woman's photo, but a different name, Angela Morse, the previous tenant of my apartment. By 11:30 p.m., I was sitting in my truck outside Garrison's building, the folder and the storage unit key on my passenger seat. I'd thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I was being stalked because I'd vandalized an apartment? That someone was hiding things in my walls? The woman appeared at exactly midnight, walking out from the same corner where she'd disappeared earlier. She got into the passenger seat without invitation, bringing with her a smell like mothballs and something sweet gone bad. "Angela Morse," I said, and she smiled wider, showing teeth that were too white, too perfect. "I lived in 4B for 3 years," she said, her voice flat and calm. "Mr. Garrison evicted me too. Late rent, just like you. So I did exactly what you did, except I used dead mice and sulfur." She pulled out her phone, showing me a video of myself that night putting fish in the walls. "I've been watching the building ever since, waiting for someone else to do it. You're the third one." She leaned closer, and I could see her pupils were dilated despite the streetlight streaming in. "The storage unit has everything you need to clean Garrison's apartment properly. You're going to fix what you did, and you're going to pay for the restoration. If you don't, every police department in the state gets these videos, plus the ones I'll create showing you doing much worse things." I spent the next 4 days cleaning that apartment under Angela's supervision. She had keys to the building. She'd made copies years ago and had been coming and going ever since, living in the basement storage area that Garrison never checked. The cleaning supplies in the storage unit were professional grade, and she knew exactly where every piece of fish was hidden, because she'd watched me do it through tiny cameras she'd installed in the apartment months before I'd even been evicted. She made me document everything, take photos of the damage, write a confession that she kept along with the videos. The bill from the restoration company came to $3,800, which wiped out my savings and maxed out my credit card. But the worst part was what she told me while I was scrubbing the floors about the other 2 tenants she'd caught. One had moved to another state after paying her off, still sends her money every month to keep quiet. The other one, a guy named Bradley, had refused to cooperate. She showed me a news article on her phone about him being arrested for breaking into multiple apartments in the building, with clear video evidence that she had obviously doctored, but that looked completely real. After it was over, after I'd paid and cleaned and humiliated myself, Angela gave me one final envelope. Inside was a photo of my new apartment building and a list of every tenant living there, their apartment numbers, their schedules that she'd somehow figured out. "I'll be watching," she said, getting out of my truck for the last time. "Not just you, but everyone in your building. If any of them get evicted and try what you tried, I'll know, and you'll be the one I call to help me teach them a lesson. You're part of this now." That was 6 months ago, and I've moved twice since then, but I still get postcards sometimes. No message, just photos of apartment buildings I don't recognize. Last week I got a call from an unknown number at 3 a.m. It was just breathing at first. Then Angela's voice. "Someone in Columbus just got evicted from a Garrison property. They seem angry. I might need you soon." I changed my number the next day, but I know it won't matter. She found me twice already when I moved. I sleep with my lights on now, and I've become the perfect tenant. Rent paid 2 weeks early, never a complaint, never a sound. Because I know what happens to people who get evicted and make bad choices. And I know there's someone out there, watching, waiting for them to cross that line. The house smelled like vanilla candles and new carpet when Mrs. Brennan opened the door that October night in 2017. She wore this black cocktail dress with pearls, apologizing 3 times in the first minute about running late for her corporate event downtown. At 18, I'd been picking up babysitting jobs through a neighborhood app to help with college expenses, and her listing had caught my eye. 6-year-old boy, newer development on the north side, $50 for what she estimated would be 4 hours tops. The whole neighborhood had that manufactured perfection vibe. Every lawn identical, every driveway sporting either a minivan or an SUV. Mrs. Brennan moved through her house like a whirlwind, pointing out emergency numbers stuck to the stainless steel fridge, explaining Oliver's bedtime routine while checking her phone every 30 seconds. Her son sat cross-legged in the living room, surrounded by Legos, wearing dinosaur pajamas that made him look even smaller than he was. Kid had these enormous brown eyes, but barely said 2 words when we were introduced. Just went right back to building what looked like a space station made entirely of blue blocks. Mrs. Brennan showed me everything twice. The landline in the kitchen, the first aid kit under the bathroom sink, the spare key hidden under a decorative rock near the back door that she said looked exactly like a real rock, but wasn't. The house felt massive compared to my family's 2-bedroom apartment across town, with its cathedral ceilings and this fancy smart home system where you could dim the lights using an app. She kept mentioning her boss, how he always kept everyone late at these quarterly meetings, how she'd definitely be back by 11, but midnight was the absolute latest if they got stuck networking. Oliver didn't even look up when she kissed him goodbye, too focused on finding the right piece for his creation. After her car pulled out of the driveway, the house settled into this comfortable quiet, just the click of Legos and the hum of the heating system kicking on. We spent the first hour building towers and knocking them down, then moved on to reading books about construction vehicles until his eyes started getting heavy around 8:30. Getting Oliver to bed turned out to be easier than expected. He brushed his teeth without arguing, picked out a stuffed triceratops to sleep with, and only asked for 1 glass of water before conking out completely. By 9 o'clock, I had the house to myself, scrolling through Netflix on their massive TV while eating microwave popcorn Mrs. Brennan said I could help myself to. The living room windows faced the backyard, nothing but darkness and the occasional motion sensor light from the neighbors' yards flickering on when a cat passed through. Every house on the street looked identical from what I could see. Same floor plan, just flipped or rotated, which made the whole neighborhood feel like a maze if you weren't paying attention. I'd settled on some true crime documentary, the irony not lost on me now, when I heard the first noise around 10:15. It sounded like someone had bumped into the garbage cans on the side of the house, that distinctive plastic scraping against concrete sound. I muted the TV and listened, but everything went quiet again, so I figured it was just a raccoon, or maybe the wind knocking something over. 10:30 came and went with no word from Mrs. Brennan, which didn't worry me since she'd warned about potentially running late. I'd already texted my roommate that I might not be back until after midnight, and the $50 would be worth the wait. The house had this weird quality where sounds carried differently than you'd expect. I could hear the ice maker in the kitchen from the living room, but Oliver's room upstairs might as well have been in another building for how quiet it was. Around 10:45, I heard something else, this time from the back of the house near the kitchen. It was different from the garbage can noise, more deliberate, like someone testing the sliding glass door. I stood up from the couch, my heart starting to pick up speed, and crept toward the kitchen, keeping the lights off so I could see outside without being seen. The motion sensor light in the backyard was on, but I couldn't see anyone, just the patio furniture casting long shadows across the deck. That's when I saw him. a man in dark clothes standing by the fake rock where Mrs. Brennan had shown me the spare key. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, just average looking except for the ski mask pulled down over his face and the crowbar in his right hand. My entire body went rigid as I watched him pick up the rock, find the key, and walk toward the back door like he had all the time in the world. The smart home system had a panic button on the app, but my phone was back in the living room on the coffee table, and moving would put me directly in his line of sight through the glass door. I pressed myself against the wall next to the refrigerator, trying to control my breathing as I heard the key slide into the lock. The door opened with this soft whoosh sound, and suddenly he was inside the house, maybe 10 feet away from where I was hiding. He stood there for a moment, listening, the crowbar tapping against his thigh in this rhythmic pattern that made my chest tighten with each tap. He moved into the living room first, and I could hear him opening drawers, dumping things out, muttering to himself about finding the safe and the jewelry. His voice was raspy, like he'd been smoking for years, and he kept clearing his throat in this disgusting way that made me want to gag. I knew I had seconds to make a decision. Oliver was upstairs completely defenseless, and this man clearly thought the house was empty. I slipped out of my hiding spot and grabbed a knife from the magnetic strip on the wall, the biggest one I could find, then started creeping toward the stairs. The TV was still on but muted, casting these flickering shadows that made everything look distorted and wrong. I could hear him in the dining room now, pulling out china from the cabinet, and I used the noise as cover to sprint up the carpeted stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Oliver's door was cracked open, his nightlight casting a soft glow into the hallway, and I could see him sleeping peacefully with his triceratops clutched to his chest. I slipped into Oliver's room and locked the door as quietly as possible, then grabbed his kid-sized desk chair and wedged it under the doorknob like I'd seen in movies. My mind was racing through options. Mrs. Brennan's emergency numbers were downstairs on the fridge. My phone was in the living room, and the landline was in the kitchen where the intruder had entered. Oliver had one of those toy phones in his room, the kind that makes sounds when you press the buttons, and for one insane second I actually picked it up before reality crashed back. The window in his room overlooked the front yard, and I considered trying to climb out with him, but it was a straight drop onto concrete at least 15 feet down. I could hear the man downstairs getting more aggressive, furniture scraping across floors, glass breaking in what sounded like the kitchen. Then I remembered Mrs. Brennan mentioning something during her tour. She'd pointed to a tablet mounted on Oliver's wall, said it was connected to the home security system so she could check on him at night. I rushed over to it, swiping frantically until I found what looked like an emergency button, a red icon with panic written underneath. The moment I pressed it, an alarm started blaring through the house, so loud that Oliver shot up in bed, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. I dropped the knife on his dresser and rushed over to him, pulling him into my arms and covering his ears while whispering that everything was okay. We were just playing a game, a really important game where we had to be brave and quiet. The intruder downstairs let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush, and I heard him running through the house, knocking more things over in his rush. Oliver was trembling against me, asking why the alarm was so loud, why I looked scared, and I just kept repeating that we were safe, help was coming, we just had to wait a little bit longer. Through the chaos of the alarm, I could hear the man downstairs yelling something about stupid kids, and wasn't supposed to be anyone here, his voice getting closer to the stairs. The doorknob rattled violently, and the chair I'd wedged against it jumped with each impact as he tried to force his way in. The pounding on the door got harder, and I could see the wood around the lock starting to splinter with each hit, from what I assumed was the crowbar. Oliver was crying now, his little body shaking as he buried his face in my shoulder, and I grabbed the knife again with my free hand, positioning myself between him and the door. Part of the door frame cracked, and through the gap I could see a sliver of the hallway, the man's dark shape moving frantically as he worked to break through. Started screaming at the top of my lungs. Not words, just pure noise to let him know we were here, we were awake, and maybe make him think twice. He screamed back, Something about how he didn't want to hurt anyone, but we needed to shut up and give him what he came for. I yelled that the police were coming, that they'd be here any second, and he actually stopped for a moment, breathing heavy on the other side of the door. In that brief silence between alarm wails, I heard something beautiful sirens in the distance, getting louder, getting closer. The man must have heard them too, because he let out another curse, and I heard him running down the stairs, his footsteps heavy and desperate. Through Oliver's window, I saw him burst out the front door. He'd ditched the ski mask somewhere inside, and I got a clear look at his face in the porch light. He had this patchy beard, a crooked nose like it had been broken before, and a tattoo on his neck that looked like some kind of bird or maybe a dragon. He sprinted across the lawn and disappeared between two houses just as the first police car came screaming around the corner, lights painting the whole street red and blue. I stayed in that room with Oliver pressed against me, still holding that knife, until I heard the officers announcing themselves downstairs. Even then, I made them show their badges through the crack in the door before I moved that chair and let them in. Oliver wouldn't let go of me, his small fingers twisted in my shirt, and I ended up carrying him downstairs while trying to explain everything to the officers. Mrs. Brennan arrived 20 minutes later in complete hysterics, her makeup running down her face as she alternated between hugging Oliver and thanking me over and over. The police had already taken my statement, walked through the house documenting everything the intruder had touched or broken. The TV was gone, along with some electronics from the office, but he'd fled before finding whatever safe he was looking for. Turns out Mrs. Brennan's ex-husband had been bragging at some bar about the cash he kept in his old house, not mentioning he didn't live there anymore, and this guy had been casing the place for weeks, waiting for the right night. They caught him 3 blocks away, hiding in someone's shed, still carrying the stolen items in a pillowcase like some cartoon burglar. The detective said my description matched perfectly, down to the dragon tattoo that turned out to be his gang identifier from a stint in prison. Mrs. Brennan tried to give me $200 on top of the babysitting money, but I couldn't take it. I was just glad Oliver was okay, even though he wouldn't let go of his mom and kept asking if the bad man was going to come back. I still babysit occasionally, but never for strangers anymore, and I always check every lock twice, sometimes 3 times. Oliver's doing better now, Mrs. Brennan sent me a message last Christmas with a photo of him in his school play, dressed as a shepherd, and grinning at the camera. She mentioned he still sleeps with that triceratops, and sometimes asks about the brave babysitter who protected him from the bad man. The guy got 8 years for breaking and entering, attempted robbery and child endangerment, though I heard he tried to claim he thought the house was empty, that it was all a misunderstanding. Sometimes I drive past that neighborhood and remember how normal everything seemed when I first walked through that door, how quickly a regular babysitting job turned into the most terrifying night of my life. But mostly I'm just grateful. Grateful I trusted my instincts, grateful that alarm system worked, and grateful I was there to stand between Oliver and someone who might have hurt him if he'd found him alone. Every summer until I turned 14, my family rented the same cabin near Pine Ridge Lake in northern Michigan. We'd been going there since I was maybe 5 or 6, and by the time I was 11, I knew every trail, every fishing spot, every creaky floorboard in that old place. My parents loved it because it was cheap and isolated. The nearest neighbor was about a quarter mile through thick woods, and the closest town was a 40-minute drive on winding dirt roads. That isolation is what made it perfect for family bonding, my dad always said. No TV, no internet, just card games and fishing and campfires. But that isolation is also what made what I saw that night in August 2008 possible. Nobody around to hear anything, nobody to call for help, just miles of dark forest and a kid who shouldn't have been awake at 2 in the morning. I'd always been a light sleeper, and that particular night the heat was unbearable. Our cabin didn't have AC, just some old ceiling fans that barely moved the humid air around. My younger sister Katie was snoring in the bunk below me, and my parents' room was at the other end of the hallway. I remember lying there, sweating through my Pokemon pajamas when I heard something outside. Not unusual, since deer and raccoons were always nosing around. But this sound was different. Rhythmic. Like something heavy being dragged, then stopping, then being dragged again. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. I crept to the window that faced the big field behind our cabin, the one that stretched about 200 yards before hitting the tree line. The moon was nearly full that night, bright enough that I could see without squinting. And there he was. A man in dark clothes pulling something wrapped in a blue tarp across the grass, leaving a dark trail behind him in the silver moonlight. The man was big, maybe 6'3", with shoulders like a linebacker. He wore what looked like a mechanic's coveralls and heavy work boots that left deep impressions in the damp grass. Every few yards he'd stop, wipe his forehead with his sleeve, and look around. The tarp was secured with yellow rope, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store, wrapped several times around whatever was inside. The shape was wrong somehow, lumpy and bent at odd angles, maybe 5 or 6 feet long. When he dragged it, one end seemed heavier than the other, making him lean hard to one side with the effort. I pressed my face against the screen, trying to see better, and that's when the window frame creaked. Not loud, but in that silent night, it might as well have been a gunshot. The man stopped instantly, his head snapping up like a deer catching a scent. He turned slowly toward our cabin, and even from that distance, maybe 70 yards away, I could see his face clearly in the moonlight. He had a thick mustache and deep-set eyes that seemed to be scanning each window methodically. His face was round and flushed from exertion, with sweat making his forehead shine. He stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, just staring at our cabin while I held my breath behind the window screen. Then he did something that still makes my skin prickle when I think about it. He smiled. Not a normal smile, but this slow, deliberate stretching of his lips while his eyes stayed completely flat and cold. He raised one hand and gave a small wave, like he was greeting a neighbor over a fence. Then he bent down, grabbed the rope again, and continued dragging the tarp toward the woods, never looking back, moving with this casual confidence like he knew I wouldn't tell anyone. I watched him disappear into the tree line, the blue tarp catching on bushes and branches as he pulled it deeper into the darkness. My legs felt like jelly, and I realized I'd been holding the windowsill so tight my knuckles were white. Part of me wanted to wake my parents, but what would I say? That I saw someone dragging something heavy into the woods? My dad would probably think it was a poacher with a deer, maybe give me a lecture about spying on people. Plus, that smile and wave, it felt like a warning, like we had an understanding now, him and me. I crawled back into my bunk and pulled the sheet over my head, listening to every little sound for the rest of the night. The ceiling fan clicking, Katie's breathing, a screech owl somewhere outside. I kept imagining footsteps on the porch, that man coming back to make sure I stayed quiet. When morning finally came and my mom made pancakes like nothing had happened, I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. The rest of that vacation, I was jumpy and weird. I wouldn't go fishing alone, stayed close to the cabin, and absolutely refused to go anywhere near the tree line where he'd disappeared. My parents thought I was going through some pre-teen phase, moping around and reading comic books instead of exploring like usual. On our last day, we were packing the car when our neighbor from down the road, Mr. Holloway, walked over with his beagle. He was this chatty retired guy who always knew all the local gossip, and he started telling my dad about how someone had broken into the old Whitman place about a mile north. Nothing stolen, but they'd found the back door kicked in and muddy boot prints everywhere. Probably kids, Mr. Holloway said, scratching his beagle's ears. But still, makes you think twice about leaving your place empty for the winter. My dad agreed, and they talked for a while about installing better locks and maybe getting a security camera. I stood there loading sleeping bags into the trunk, thinking about those heavy boot prints I'd seen in the grass, wondering if the Whitman place was where that man had come from before I saw him. We stopped going to Pine Ridge Lake after that summer. My dad got promoted, and we started taking fancier vacations to beach resorts and theme parks. I never told anyone about what I saw that night, and honestly, as years passed, the memory started to feel less real. Maybe it really had been a poacher. Maybe the tarp had been full of equipment or trash or something totally innocent. By the time I hit high school, I'd mostly stopped thinking about it except for the occasional nightmare where I'd see that flat smile and casual wave. Life moved on. College at Michigan State, a marketing job in Chicago, getting married to my wife Jessica, having our daughter Lily. Normal stuff. The kind of life where men dragging tarps through fields at night doesn't happen. Then last month I was doom scrolling through news articles during my lunch break when I saw a headline that made me spill coffee all over my keyboard. Serial killer Donald Brewster dies in prison, linked to 11 deaths in northern Michigan. The article had his mugshot from 2016 when they'd finally caught him. Round face, thick mustache going gray, those same deep-set eyes I'd seen in the moonlight. Donald Brewster, age 67 at time of death, had worked as a mechanic and handyman around the Pine Ridge Lake area from 1995 to 2015. He'd been convicted of killing 3 women, but investigators believed he was responsible for at least 8 more deaths based on remains found buried in the woods around various properties where he'd done work. The article included a map showing where bodies had been discovered, and there it was, a cluster of red dots in the forest behind the cabin my family used to rent. The property had been owned by the same family trust for decades, hiring Brewster regularly for maintenance and repairs. He'd had keys to most of the cabins, including ours. He knew when renters came and went, knew which places sat empty, knew those woods better than anyone. The prosecutor called him methodical and patient, someone who could wait months or even years between killings. I spent the rest of that day going down a rabbit hole of news coverage about Brewster. The victims were mostly women traveling alone, or sex workers from nearby cities, but there were also 2 men who'd gone missing while camping in the area. One article mentioned that Brewster would often dispose of evidence by wrapping bodies in tarps and burying them deep in the woods, sometimes keeping them in utility sheds or abandoned structures for days before finding the right spot. August 2008, I looked it up. A woman named Teresa Vaughn had disappeared from a truck stop about 20 miles from Pine Ridge Lake. Her remains were found in 2016, buried less than 300 yards from where our cabin had been. She'd been wrapped in a blue tarp, just like what I'd seen. The medical examiner estimated she'd been dead for 8 to 10 years, which put her death right around the time of that summer. Reading her description made me sick. She was 32, had 2 kids, was trying to get clean and get her life back together. Her sister was quoted saying Teresa had been excited about a job interview the day she disappeared. What really got to me, though, was a detail buried in one of the longer investigative pieces about the case. Multiple witnesses over the years had reported seeing Brewster in places he shouldn't have been. Near homes at odd hours, walking through private property, always with some excuse about checking pipes or looking for lost tools. But here's the part that made me close my laptop and walk around my office building 3 times just to clear my head. At least 4 people, including 2 children, had reported seeing him at night over the years, and each time he'd noticed them watching, he'd smiled and waved before walking away. The detective interviewed for the article said it was likely a power move, a way of saying, "I see you seeing me and I'm not worried about it." Those witnesses had all been too scared or uncertain to report anything at the time. The detective believed Brewster got a thrill from being seen, from knowing people were too afraid or too unsure to act on what they'd witnessed. I called in sick for the rest of the week and drove up to Pine Ridge Lake. I don't know what I expected to find. Closure, maybe, or just proof that it had all been real. The area looked different now, more developed, with new houses where there used to be empty lots. Our old cabin had been torn down, replaced by a modern lake house with huge windows and a 2-car garage. I parked at the public boat launch and walked through the woods to where I thought those bodies had been found. There were still remnants of yellow police tape tied to some trees, faded and shredded by weather. I stood there for a long time, thinking about Teresa Vaughn and all the others, wondering if me speaking up as a kid could have changed anything. Probably not. Who would have believed an 11-year-old talking about seeing a man with a tarp? Still, the guilt sits heavy in my chest. I found the spot where I think he'd entered the woods that night, and there was this old utility shed about 50 yards in, half collapsed and covered in vines. The kind of place he might have used to store things temporarily. The kind of place that would have been invisible in the dark unless you knew exactly where to look. I've been seeing a therapist since that trip, trying to process everything. She says survivor's guilt is common even when there was nothing you could have realistically done. My wife thinks I should contact the police, maybe help with cold cases or give some kind of statement. But what would be the point now? Brewster's dead. Died of a heart attack in his cell 6 months ago. The families have whatever closure they're going to get. I did reach out to Teresa Vaughn's sister through Facebook, just to say I was sorry for her loss, though I didn't mention what I'd seen. She thanked me and said, Teresa loved being outdoors, loved camping and fishing, which is why she'd been drawn to that area. It made me think about how Brewster had corrupted something beautiful, turned those peaceful woods into a graveyard. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear that dragging sound, and I have to remind myself it's just the ceiling fan or the cat playing with something downstairs. But what really haunts me isn't the sound or even the image of that tarp. It's that wave, that casual acknowledgement that said he knew I was just a scared kid who wouldn't do anything. And he was right. I kept his secret for 16 years while he kept killing, and now I have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life. The Andersons' house sat 40 minutes outside Burlington, Vermont, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional deer crossing. I was 24, piecing together income from pet-sitting gigs and food delivery apps, while sending out resumes for marketing positions that never called back. When their request popped up on the app, a full week watching 2 golden retrievers for $500. I accepted immediately without really thinking about how isolated their property would be. They were heading to Italy for their daughter's wedding and needed someone responsible to stay at the house, not just drop by twice a day like most jobs. Buddy and Rosie, their dogs, were sweethearts according to the profile. 8-year-old Buddy apparently loved napping on the couch, while 2-year-old Rosie needed lots of exercise and attention. The estate covered 12 acres with a private road, a pool house, and forest trails that the dogs knew by heart. Everything seemed perfect those first 2 days in early November. I worked on cover letters from their granite kitchen island that was bigger than my entire studio apartment, threw tennis balls for Rosie until my arm ached, and let Buddy sprawl across my lap while I watched movies on their 70-inch TV. The Andersons had left a novel's worth of instructions: alarm codes, Wi-Fi passwords, emergency contacts, feeding schedules, which doors to keep locked, how to operate their space-age coffee machine. At the bottom of their typed notes, almost like an afterthought, they'd mentioned the only neighbor within a mile. Harold Fitzgerald, Stonehouse down the road, is 73 with mild dementia. Daughter Nancy visits Mon/Wed/Fry. Very friendly but gets confused sometimes. If he stops by, just be nice and call Nancy if needed. Number on fridge. I'd barely registered the information, too distracted by the luxury of having a massive house to myself. Thursday started like any other day there. I woke up around 7 when Rosie jumped on the bed, her tail wagging hard enough to knock the lamp off the nightstand. After feeding both dogs and making coffee in the Andersons' restaurant-grade machine, I settled in for another day of job applications. Around noon, I noticed a man standing at the edge of the property, just where the gravel driveway met the main road. He wore a thick flannel jacket despite the mild weather and held binoculars up to his face, pointed directly at the house. Harold Fitzgerald, I assumed, though he looked frailer than I'd imagined, his white hair sticking up in patches like he'd just woken up. I waved from the kitchen window, but he didn't wave back, just kept those binoculars trained on the house for another minute before shuffling back toward the road. Weird, but harmless enough. The Andersons had said he got confused. By evening, things took a stranger turn. I was preparing the dogs' dinner around 6:30 when Buddy started growling, something the Andersons' note said he never did unless something was really wrong. Through the dining room window, I could see Mr. Fitzgerald again, this time much closer, maybe 20 feet from the house, crouched behind the Andersons' SUV in the driveway. He had something in his hands that caught the motion sensor lights. At first I thought it was a walking stick, but the way he held it, pressed against his shoulder, made my chest tighten. Rosie started barking, that sharp, aggressive bark I hadn't heard from her before. The old man was moving between the cars now, staying low, and I realized with absolute clarity that he was holding a hunting rifle. Not pointed at anything yet, but carried like someone who knew exactly how to use it. I grabbed my phone to call Nancy, fumbling with the paper on the fridge until I found her number. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. Meanwhile, Mr. Fitzgerald had made it to the front porch, rifle still in his hands, trying to peer through the frosted glass panels beside the door. The dogs were going absolutely insane now, Buddy's deep barks mixing with Rosie's higher-pitched warnings. I could hear him trying the doorknob, jiggling it hard when it didn't open. Then he started pounding on the door with his fist, shouting something I couldn't make out over the dogs. I ran to the front hallway, keeping low, and heard him clearly. "I know you're in there. Saw you sneaking around all week. The Andersons are in Italy. You think I'm stupid? Open this door before I call the real police." His voice was rough, angry, but also wavering, like he might be scared too. The situation hit me all at once. He thought I was robbing the place. In his confused mind, he'd been watching a stranger in his neighbor's house for days and decided to take matters into his own hands. I tried yelling back, "Mr. Fitzgerald, I'm pet sitting. The Andersons hired me. Please put the gun down." But he just got angrier, screaming that criminals always had stories, that he'd been watching houses on this road for 40 years and knew a thief when he saw one. He moved to the living room window, the huge one that faced the front yard, and started tapping on it with the rifle barrel. Not hard enough to break it, but steady, rhythmic taps while he peered inside. I could see his face clearly in the porch light. Deep wrinkles, wild gray eyes, spittle on his chin from shouting. He looked nothing like the harmless, confused elderly man the Andersons had described. I decided to call 911, even though the Andersons had mentioned the nearest police station was 35 minutes away. The dispatcher sounded tired until I mentioned the word rifle. Then her voice sharpened immediately. She kept me on the line, asking for the exact address, whether anyone was hurt, if I could get to a safe room. While I was spelling out the road name, Mr. Fitzgerald had circled around to the back of the house. The dogs followed his movement from inside, running from window to window, their barking reaching a fever pitch. Through the kitchen window, I watched him try the back door, then check under the doormat and several rocks in the garden, looking for a spare key. He found one under a ceramic frog near the garden hose, held it up to the light like a prize. The dispatcher was saying something about officers being en route, but all I could focus on was that key in his weathered hand, the way he walked back to the door with purpose. The lock turned with a click that seemed to echo through the whole house. I grabbed both dogs by their collars and pulled them into the master bedroom with me, slamming the door and turning the lock just as I heard his boots on the kitchen tile. "Where are you, you little thief?" he called out, his voice calmer now, almost conversational. "Come on out and we can wait for the police together. Got my rifle here to make sure you don't try anything funny." His footsteps were slow, methodical. I could track his movement through the house, kitchen to dining room to living room. He was checking behind furniture, opening closet doors. The dogs were trembling against my legs, Buddy whimpering low in his throat while Rosie kept growling. The dispatcher was asking questions I could barely process. All I could think about was that bedroom door, whether the lock would hold, whether he'd even try it, or assume a thief would try to escape rather than hide. Then his footsteps started up the stairs, each creak of the old wood sending a jolt through my body. The master bedroom was at the end of the hallway, past 3 other rooms he'd have to check first. I heard doors opening, hangers sliding in closets, his muffled voice talking to himself about what kind of person breaks into a house to steal when the owners are clearly gone for days. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm, that units were 15 minutes out now. but 15 minutes felt like a lifetime. I looked around the room for anything I could use to defend myself, a heavy lamp maybe, or the iron bookend on the dresser. But what good would any of that do against a rifle? Mr. Fitzgerald was at the second bedroom now, just 2 doors away. I could hear him more clearly. Saw you carrying bags out yesterday morning. Think I don't notice? Been writing it all down in my notebook. The bedroom doorknob rattled. I held my breath, pressing my back against the far wall, both dogs now silent as if they understood the danger. I know you're in there, he said, his voice right against the door. This door's locked and the others weren't. You got nowhere to go. He knocked 3 times with what sounded like the rifle stock. Nancy always said I worry too much about security, but look who was right. Caught you red-handed. The dispatcher was saying something about not engaging, about finding a window if possible, but the master bedroom windows had decorative metal grating on the outside. The Andersons were serious about security, ironically enough. I whispered into the phone that he was right outside, that I was trapped. Then I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The sound of him loading a round into the rifle's chamber. That distinctive mechanical click-clack that you never forget once you've heard it. Mr. Fitzgerald, I tried one more time, my voice shaking but loud. Please call your daughter Nancy. Call her right now and she'll tell you the Andersons hired me. I have their contact information. I have emails. I can show you everything. There was silence for a moment, then a bitter laugh. You probably killed Nancy too, didn't you? That's why she hasn't answered her phone all day. Police are gonna find her body somewhere, mark my words. The doorknob rattled harder this time, like he was testing how strong the lock was. Then suddenly, Rosie did something I'll never forget. She started howling, this long, mournful sound that dogs sometimes make when they hear sirens. Buddy joined in, both of them howling together. It must have triggered something in Mr. Fitzgerald because he stopped rattling the door. Buddy, he said, confusion creeping into his voice. Rosie girl, is that you? The dogs kept howling and I could hear him stepping back from the door. Those are the Andersons' dogs, he said, but now he sounded uncertain, like someone waking up from a dream. The next few minutes stretched like hours. I could hear him pacing the hallway, muttering to himself, occasionally calling the dogs names. The dispatcher told me units were 5 minutes out, to keep the dogs making noise if possible. I encouraged them to keep howling, even though the sound was eerie in the dark bedroom. Then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens in the distance, growing louder. Mr. Fitzgerald heard them too. Finally, he said, but his voice had changed completely, sounding tired and confused. Police can sort this mess out. His footsteps retreated down the stairs, slow and heavy. I stayed locked in that room, holding both dogs, until I heard the officers' voices in the house, identifying themselves, asking Mr. Fitzgerald to put the weapon down. There was no confrontation, no drama, just an old confused man saying he'd caught a burglar and waited for police like a good citizen should. The officers found me 20 minutes later, after they'd secured Mr. Fitzgerald's rifle and had him sitting in their patrol car. Nancy arrived shortly after, hysterical and apologizing over and over. Her phone had died during her shift at the hospital, and she'd had no idea her father had taken his hunting rifle from the locked cabinet in his basement. Turns out he'd been keeping that notebook for months, documenting every car that drove by, every person walking their dog, convinced the neighborhood was under surveillance by criminals. The dementia was worse than anyone realized. Nancy had been trying to get him into assisted living, but he'd been resistant, still capable of seeming lucid most days. The officers took my statement while I sat on the porch steps, Buddy's head in my lap, Rosie pressed against my side. They said I'd done everything right, called 911, didn't confront him, found a secure location. But my whole body wouldn't stop trembling for hours afterward. The Andersons cut their trip short when I called them that night, horrified at what had happened. They paid me triple the agreed amount and offered to cover therapy if I needed it. Mr. Fitzgerald was placed in a memory care facility 2 weeks later. Nancy couldn't risk him accessing weapons again. I finished out the week at a hotel with Buddy and Rosie, visiting the house only during daylight to feed them and let them run in the yard. I still pet sit, but never overnight, and never in isolated houses. Sometimes I dream about that sound, the rifle being loaded, that mechanical click-clack in the hallway. But mostly I think about how thin the line is between being a neighbor checking on things and becoming the danger yourself. How a mind can construct an entirely different reality and act on it with absolute conviction. The police told me later that Mr. Fitzgerald had written in his notebook that he'd seen me casing the house, that I'd been taking photos and measuring windows. His mind, he was a hero that night, protecting his neighbor's property. In mine, those hours remain the most terrifying of my life. Phoenix gets brutal in July, and that night was no exception. 110 degrees even after midnight, the kind of heat that makes you do stupid things just to feel alive. I was 23 then, working at a call center that sucked the soul out of me 5 days a week, which meant weekends were sacred. My buddy Jake had just turned 24, and his house party had been going strong until the cops showed up around midnight, killing the vibe and sending everyone scattering to their cars. 6 of us weren't ready to call it quits, though. We were standing in his driveway, sweating through our shirts and passing around the last warm beer from the cooler, when someone, I think it was Tommy, mentioned the Desert Palm Motel, 40 minutes out on Route 60, the kind of place that took cash and didn't ask questions, where nobody would care how much noise we made. The Desert Palm was a relic from the 60s that somehow survived into 2016, a long stretch of rooms with doors that faced the parking lot and a flickering neon sign missing half its letters. We pooled our cash at the front desk, while this ancient guy with a glass eye counted it twice before sliding us the key to room 108. The place was a dump orange shag carpet that crunched when you walked on it, wood paneling that was coming apart at the seams, and a bathroom mirror with a crack running diagonal across the whole thing. But for $50 and no questions asked, it was perfect for what we needed. Jake had grabbed a cooler of beer from his trunk. Megan brought the leftover birthday cake. Carlos showed up with a bottle of Jack Daniels he'd been saving, and Ashley had this portable speaker that could wake the dead. Tommy and I stopped at a gas station for bags of chips and energy drinks, thinking we'd party until sunrise. Around 2 in the morning, we were all pretty wasted. Jake was sitting on one of the beds doing terrible impressions of our old high school teachers, while Megan filmed him on her phone, laughing so hard she kept having to restart the videos. Carlos and Ashley had claimed the corner by the air conditioner, which barely worked, but at least made some noise to cover up whatever they were whispering about. Tommy was mixing drinks in the tiny coffee cups the motel provided, creating these nasty combinations he'd name after celebrities. I remember one called the Brad Pitt, that was basically just whiskey with a splash of warm Red Bull. The music was loud enough that we had to yell to hear each other, and every time someone went outside to smoke or grab something from the car, they'd come back drenched in sweat from just those few seconds in the heat. We were being idiots, plain and simple, the kind of loud, obnoxious guests that every motel manager hates. That's when Jake got the brilliant idea that ruined everything. He was standing by the door, swaying a little, with this grin that meant trouble. "Yo, watch this," he said, and before anyone could stop him, he yanked open our door and started pounding on the door next to ours, room 109. Not just knocking, but really hammering on it with both fists, yelling in this fake deep voice, "Police, open up, we know you're in there." Then he bolted back into our room, slamming the door behind him and collapsing on the floor in hysterics. We all laughed for about 5 seconds until we heard the other door open. Not slowly, like someone checking what the noise was about, but fast and hard, like it had been kicked. Through our thin walls, we heard footsteps, heavy ones, and then 3 sharp knocks on our door. Not pounding like Jake had done, but deliberate, measured knocks that somehow sounded way more threatening. Everyone went quiet. The music was still playing, some rap song with heavy bass, but nobody was moving or talking anymore. Jake had pushed himself up against the far wall, and his face had gone from red to pale in about 2 seconds. Megan turned off her phone and grabbed Jake's arm. The knocking came again, 3 more times, same rhythm, same force. Tommy reached over and turned off the speaker, and in the sudden silence, we could hear breathing on the other side of the door. Not normal breathing either, but this ragged, heavy sound like someone who'd just run a marathon, or was trying really hard not to lose their temper. Carlos whispered that we should just ignore it. Maybe the person would go away. But then we heard the voice low, gravelly, with this weird accent I couldn't place. Maybe Eastern European or Russian. "I know you're listening," the voice said. "The funny boy who likes to play police. Open the door. We need to talk about respect." Nobody moved to open that door. We all just stood there, frozen in place like we were playing some twisted game of statues. The doorknob rattled, not like someone trying to open it, but just testing it, letting us know they were still there. Then came the sound that made my chest tighten, metal sliding against metal followed by a click. Anyone who's been around guns knows that sound. Through the peephole, Tommy tried to get a look, but he pulled back immediately, his face white as paper. "Big dude," he whispered. "Like seriously big, tattoos all up his neck." And he's just standing there, staring at the door. The man outside spoke again, louder this time. "I'm staying here with my brother. He's sick. Very sick. Your noise, your banging, you woke him up. He hasn't slept in 3 days because of the pain. You think this is funny?" His voice cracked on the last word, and somehow that made it scarier, like he was barely holding it together. Jake finally found his voice, though it came out shaky and nothing like the tough guy act from earlier. "Hey man, I'm sorry, really sorry. It was just a stupid joke. We didn't know about your brother." But his apology seemed to make things worse. The door suddenly shook as something hit it hard. Maybe a fist, maybe a shoulder. "Stupid joke," the man repeated, and now his voice was getting louder, more unstable. "You want to see joke? I show you joke." We heard him walking away, and for a second we thought it was over. But then came the sound of another door opening and voices. The man speaking in another language, harsh and fast, and someone else responding weakly. Footsteps returned, but now there were 2 sets. Through the wall we heard someone coughing, these horrible wet coughs that went on and on. Then the man's voice again, right at our door. "My brother wants to meet the funny boys. He says maybe you can make him laugh since you already woke him up." The doorknob started turning back and forth violently, and we realized with horror that the lock was one of those old, flimsy motel locks that probably hadn't been replaced since the place was built. Carlos and Tommy threw themselves against the door trying to hold it shut, while Jake was frantically searching for his phone to call 911. But here's the thing about being out in the middle of nowhere. Cell service was garbage. 1 bar, sometimes none. Megan was crying, Ashley was pulling at the window trying to get it open, but it was painted shut or jammed from years of desert heat. The man outside had stopped trying the doorknob and was now speaking calmly, which was somehow worse. "Room 108. I remember this number. Checkout is at 11 tomorrow, but maybe you check out earlier, yes?" Then we heard him doing something to our door, scratching or carving, the sound of metal on wood, methodical and slow. He was leaving us a message, taking his time, wanting us to hear every scrape. For what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, we stayed huddled in that room, nobody speaking above a whisper. The scratching had stopped, but we could still hear them in room 109. The sick brothers coughing, furniture being moved around, and occasionally that low voice speaking in whatever language they used. Every few minutes, one of them would bang once on the wall we shared, just to let us know they were still there, still awake, still angry. Jake kept trying his phone, moving around the room to find a signal, but the best he got was 1 bar that would disappear the second he tried to make a call. Around 3:30, things got worse. We heard their door open again and footsteps on the gravel outside. Tommy peeked through a gap in the curtains and saw the big man walking to a beaten-up Ford truck in the parking lot. He pulled something long from the truck bed. Tommy said it looked like a tire iron or maybe a crowbar, and just stood there in the parking lot looking at our room, tapping the metal against his leg. That's when Ashley completely lost it. She started hyperventilating, saying we were all going to die, that we needed to run for the cars right now. But our cars were parked right next to his truck, and he was standing between us and them like he'd planned it that way. Carlos suggested we call the motel office, but the phone in the room was dead, no dial tone, nothing. Whether it had never worked or someone had cut the line, we'll never know. The man stayed out there for another 10 minutes, just standing in the heat, occasionally walking closer to our door, and then back to his truck. Finally, he went back into his room, but not before stopping at our door one more time. He didn't knock or say anything, just stood there breathing heavy enough that we could hear it. Then he said something that still gives me nightmares. My brother, he used to be wrestler, before the sickness, very strong even now. Even sick, he can break a man's arm like breadstick. We heard him laugh. Not crazy laughter, but genuine amusement, like he'd told a really good joke. The next 2 hours were pure hell. We took turns watching through the curtains while the others sat on the beds, too scared to speak. Every sound made us jump. The ice machine down the walkway, a motorcycle passing on the highway, even the air conditioner clicking on and off. Around 5 in the morning, when the sky was starting to get light, Jake had an idea. He remembered seeing an emergency exit sign at the far end of the building when we'd checked in. If we could get to it without being seen, we could circle around to the main office or at least get to the road and flag down a car. But it meant going outside, past their room. We argued about it in whispers until Tommy pointed out that we couldn't stay trapped forever. The plan was simple. Megan and Ashley would go first, walking casually like they were just going to get ice. If the coast was clear, they'd signal, and the rest of us would follow in pairs. But the second Megan touched the doorknob to leave, we heard movement in room 109. Footsteps and then their door opening. The big man was sitting in a plastic chair right outside their room, facing our door, like he'd been waiting for us to try exactly this. In the early morning light, we could see him clearly for the first time through the window. His face had these deep acne scars, and his neck tattoos continued up behind his ears. Some kind of script I didn't recognize. But the worst part was his expression. Completely calm, almost peaceful. Like a man enjoying his morning coffee. He waved at us when he saw the curtain move, then pointed at his watch and held up 6 fingers. 6 o'clock. That's when he stood up, stretched, and walked back into his room. We heard him talking to his brother, and then, clear as day through the thin walls, 1 more hour. Then we visit. That last hour felt like a countdown to execution. Jake was apologizing over and over, saying he'd pay them money, anything they wanted. Tommy was trying to break the bathroom window with the shower rod. Carlos had armed himself with a broken beer bottle. But at exactly 6 o'clock, nothing happened. No knock, no visit, nothing. We waited another 30 minutes before Tommy finally got the courage to peek outside. Their door was wide open, the room empty, the Ford truck gone. We grabbed our stuff and ran to our cars like the place was on fire, not even bothering to check out. But before we left, I had to see what he'd carved into our door. It wasn't a threat or curse words like I'd expected. It was just a single word in rough, deep letters. Quiet. On the drive back to Phoenix, nobody said much. Jake paid for the door damage a week later when the motel called. They had his credit card on file from when we'd checked in. The manager said the men in room 109 had been there for 2 weeks, that the sick brother had terminal bone cancer, and they'd been driving across the country to get him to some special treatment center in California. Made us feel about 2 inches tall. But here's what really stuck with me. When I got home and Googled the motel out of curiosity a few months later, I found a news article from September. 2 men had been arrested at a gas station in New Mexico for beating a college kid nearly to death with a tire iron. The kid had been playing loud music at the pump next to them. The article had a photo, same scarred face, same neck tattoos. The sick brother had died 2 days before the assault. Sometimes I think about how close we came to being that kid at the gas station. How a stupid prank could have ended with one of us dead or in the hospital. I still can't stay in motels, and whenever I hear someone banging on doors as a joke, my whole body tenses up. Some lessons you learn the easy way, and some you survive by pure dumb luck. I was 17 when I got the job at Burger Crown on the outskirts of Denver. One of those places that stays open until 2 a.m. and attracts all kinds of people after midnight. My parents weren't thrilled about the late shifts, but we needed the money. And Mr. Hoffman, the franchise manager, promised he'd always have someone walk me to my car after closing. He had this way of talking that made parents trust him. Soft voice, called everyone dear or son, wore those thick glasses that made his eyes look bigger than they were. I'd been working there for about 3 months when everything went sideways that night in early September. The air had that weird heaviness to it, like right before a storm, but the sky stayed clear. I remember because I kept checking through the windows, waiting for rain that never came. The restaurant had these unwritten rules that nobody talked about, but everyone followed. Never go into Mr. Hoffman's office when the door was closed, even if you heard voices inside. Don't ask about the freezer in the basement. We had 2 upstairs that worked fine. If Mr. Hoffman offered to drive you home, you always said you had a ride coming. The older employees, like Janet, who'd been there 6 years, would just give you this look if you asked questions, then change the subject to something about scheduling or cleaning duties. That particular night, I was working with Brandon, this 19-year-old kid who'd started a month after me. He had this nervous habit of cracking his knuckles every few minutes, and the sound echoed in the empty restaurant between customers. Around 11 p.m., he mentioned he'd seen Mr. Hoffman's car parked behind the dumpsters earlier, which was strange because Mr. Hoffman always parked in his designated spot right by the front door, under the light with the manager sign. Brandon kept talking about how he'd found something weird in the employee files last week when Mr. Hoffman sent him to grab supplies from the office. He wouldn't tell me exactly what, just kept saying he needed to show someone, maybe call somebody about it. I told him to leave it alone. Whatever drama was going on with management wasn't worth minimum wage plus tips. But Brandon had this thing about fairness, about doing the right thing. His dad was a cop 2 states over, and he'd grown up thinking you always report stuff that doesn't look right. The dinner rush had died down to just truckers grabbing coffee, and the occasional drunk college kids wanting 20 nuggets. Janet had left at 10:30, and it was just me, Brandon, and Roger, the cook who barely spoke English and mostly communicated through nods and hand gestures. Mr. Hoffman wasn't even supposed to be there that night. Donna, the assistant manager, usually handled Monday evenings. At 11:45, Brandon went out back to throw away trash bags, and I heard him talking to someone by the dumpsters. His voice carried through the back door that we kept propped open because the AC was broken again, and the fryer heat made the kitchen unbearable. I couldn't make out the words, but Brandon sounded excited, like he was explaining something important. Then his voice got quieter, almost like he was asking questions. After about 10 minutes, I realized I hadn't heard anything for a while. I called out his name through the back door, but all I got was the hum of the highway and crickets. Roger was cleaning the grill, that metal scraping sound filling the kitchen, and he just shrugged when I asked if he'd seen Brandon come back in. The trash bags were sitting right there by the door, still full, like Brandon had put them down and forgotten about them completely. I walked out to the dumpster area, and that's when I saw Brandon's phone on the ground. The screen cracked like someone had stepped on it. His car keys were about 5 feet away, near the employee parking spaces. But Brandon wasn't there. The security camera on that corner of the building had been spray-painted black weeks ago, and Mr. Hoffman kept saying he'd get it fixed but never did. I picked up Brandon's stuff and went back inside, thinking maybe he'd walked around to the front for some reason. Roger was already taking his apron off, ready to leave at midnight like always. I tried calling Brandon's phone from the restaurant line, and I could hear it buzzing in my hand. That's when I noticed the blood on the keychain. Not a lot, just a few drops that had already turned dark brown. My first thought was maybe he'd cut himself on something and went to find a Band-Aid, but we had a first aid kit right in the kitchen. Mr. Hoffman showed up at 12:15, coming through the front door with his keys jangling on that huge ring he always carried. He seemed surprised to see just me at the counter, asked where Brandon was in that concerned grandfather voice he used. I showed him the phone and keys, mentioned the blood, and watched his face do this thing where it went completely blank for just a second before the concern came back. He said Brandon had probably just gone home sick and forgotten his things, that kids did that sometimes when they weren't feeling well. But Brandon's car was still in the lot. I could see that beat-up Ford Ranger from the window. Mr. Hoffman said he'd handle it, told me to finish cleaning and clock out. He went to his office and made a phone call, speaking too quietly for me to hear. 20 minutes later, he came out and said he'd spoken to Brandon's roommate, that Brandon had gotten a ride home because he felt sick. The story didn't make sense, but Mr. Hoffman had this way of saying things that made you feel stupid for questioning them. The next morning, they found Brandon's body in the ravine behind the shopping complex, about a quarter mile from the restaurant. My mom woke me up at 7 a.m. because 2 detectives were at our door, wanting to know about my shift. They said Brandon had been beaten to death, probably with a metal pipe or something similar. The time of death was between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, exactly when he'd gone to take out the trash. I told them everything, gave them Brandon's broken phone and bloody keys that I'd stupidly taken home in my purse. They kept asking if I'd seen anyone else that night, if Brandon had any enemies, if there'd been any angry customers. When I mentioned Mr. Hoffman showing up after midnight and his weird explanation, they exchanged this look that made my chest tight. Detective Rivera, this woman with sharp eyes and gray streaks in her hair, asked me to repeat exactly what Mr. Hoffman had said about calling Brandon's roommate. Turns out Brandon lived alone in a studio apartment off Colfax Avenue. Within hours, I became the main suspect. My fingerprints were on Brandon's phone and keys. I was the last person who admitted to seeing him alive. The security footage from inside the restaurant showed me going to the back door multiple times, looking agitated. Mr. Hoffman told the police I'd been having problems with Brandon, that he'd caught us arguing about shift schedules the week before, which was complete fiction. Some of the other employees suddenly remembered me complaining about Brandon, which I never did. Even Janet, who'd always been nice to me, told the detectives that I seemed troubled lately. My parents hired a lawyer, this exhausted-looking man named Mr. Garfield who smelled like cigarettes, and kept telling me not to talk to anyone about the case. But I couldn't just sit there while everyone thought I'd killed Brandon. He'd been trying to tell me something that night, something about those employee files, and now he was dead. I started my own investigation, which my lawyer would have killed me for if he knew. I reached out to former employees through Facebook, people who'd worked at Burger Crown years ago. Most didn't respond, but this girl named Alicia, who'd worked there in 2014, sent me a long message at 2 a.m. She said Mr. Hoffman wasn't his real name. It was actually Frank Gilmore, and he'd done time in Kansas for assault and fraud in the early 2000s. She'd found out by accident when she'd Googled him after he'd gotten way too friendly at the Christmas party, putting his hand on her lower back and offering her rides home constantly. Alicia had screenshots of old news articles about Frank Gilmore's trial, and the mugshot looked exactly like a younger Mr. Hoffman without the glasses. She said when she'd tried to report it to the franchise owners, she'd been fired the next week for stealing money that she'd never touched. 3 other girls had similar stories. They'd noticed something wrong, tried to speak up, and suddenly they were being accused of theft or misconduct. The real breakthrough came when I remembered Brandon mentioning the basement freezer that first week we'd worked together. I drove by the restaurant at 3 a.m. on a Saturday, when I knew only Roger would be there doing his weekly deep clean. Roger didn't speak much English, but he understood enough when I showed him $20 and pointed to the basement door. He unlocked it and went back to mopping, pretending he hadn't seen me. The basement was smaller than I'd expected, just concrete walls and that old freezer humming in the corner. Inside the freezer, behind boxes of expired burger patties, I found 3 filing boxes wrapped in plastic. They were full of employee records, but not normal ones. Mr. Hoffman had been keeping detailed notes on every teenage girl who'd worked there. Photos taken without us knowing, our addresses, our schedules. notes about our families, boyfriends, habits. My file had pictures of me walking to my car at night, taken from different angles. Brandon's file was different. It just had copies of his job application and a printed email where Brandon had contacted the franchise headquarters asking about background check policies. I took photos of everything with my phone, my fingers trembling so bad I had to retake half of them. Just as I was putting the boxes back, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Mr. Hoffman was standing there in his weekend clothes, khakis and a polo shirt that made him look like somebody's harmless grandpa. He didn't look surprised to see me. He actually smiled, that same gentle smile he'd use when explaining the cash register to new employees. He said he knew I'd come eventually, that smart girls like me always figured things out. He walked closer, blocking the stairs, and started talking about how Brandon had been planning to ruin everything, how the boy didn't understand that some things were better left alone. Mr. Satiu. Hoffman said he'd given Brandon a choice that night: forget what he'd found or face the consequences. Brandon had tried to run, tried to scream for help, but the highway noise covered everything. He told me all this like he was explaining a scheduling conflict, calm and matter of fact. Then he said I had the same choice now. Roger saved my life that night. He'd heard Mr. Hoffman arrive and knew something was wrong. Roger understood more than he ever let on. He'd already called 911, telling them there was a fire at the restaurant. When we heard the sirens, Mr. Hoffman's whole demeanor changed. He grabbed my wrist, hard enough to leave bruises, and said if I showed anyone those photos, he'd make sure my story matched Brandon's ending. But I was already backing toward the freezer, and Roger appeared at the top of the stairs with the biggest kitchen knife we had. Mr. Hoffman let go and pushed past Roger, running out through the kitchen. The police arrived to find me sobbing in that basement, surrounded by evidence of years of stalking and harassment. Mr. Hoffman, Frank Gilmore, was arrested 2 days later at a motel near the state line. They found Brandon's blood on a tire iron in his trunk. He'd kept it like some kind of trophy. The trial took 8 months, and I testified for 3 hours about that night and everything I'd found. He got life without parole. The restaurant closed permanently, and the franchise owners paid settlements to 17 former employees who came forward after the arrest. I still have nightmares about that gentle smile and those giant eyes behind thick glasses, but at least Brandon's family knows the truth now. Roger testified too, through a translator, about all the things he'd seen over the years but hadn't known how to report. He said he'd been documenting things in his own way, taking pictures when Mr. Hoffman wasn't looking, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. It's strange to think about now, but during that period of my life I was juggling overdue rent notices, utility bills stacked on the kitchen counter, and a job at a diner that barely covered groceries. Most nights I went to bed wondering how long I could keep the lights on. That's when I stumbled into a conversation online with a guy named Marcus. He wasn't pushy, just casual, asking if I ever wanted extra cash for easy errands. I laughed it off at first, but he kept it vague enough to spark my curiosity. He said it was just dropping off packages around town. No questions asked. The promise of money up front made it sound almost too convenient. At that point, my judgment was clouded by desperation. Marcus explained that drivers were in short supply and it was completely legal, just private deliveries for people who didn't trust shipping companies. He told me I'd make more in one day than I usually did in a week of serving tables. I wanted to believe him. The thought of catching up on rent, maybe even buying groceries without counting pennies, pulled me in. He mentioned I could start the following morning, and all I had to do was meet him in a parking lot near a strip mall to pick up the first set of boxes. When I showed up, he wasn't alone. A man with thinning blonde hair, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt, leaned against the trunk of a beat-up sedan. He introduced himself as Tommy's cousin, though I'd never heard of a Tommy. He barely looked at me while he slid 2 medium-sized boxes into my back seat. They weren't heavy, maybe the size of shoeboxes, sealed with plain brown tape. What unsettled me, though, was how quickly he told me to leave once the packages were loaded. No paperwork, no instructions besides an address scribbled on an index card. The exchange took less than 2 minutes. I told myself not to overthink it. After all, who cares what's in a package if you're just the delivery person? But while driving to the drop-off, I kept glancing at those boxes in my rearview mirror, as if they might shift on their own. The houses blurred by, ordinary suburban lawns with kids' bikes left on sidewalks and dogs barking behind fences. When I pulled up to the address, a 2-story house with peeling white paint, a woman with sharp cheekbones and dark circles under her eyes opened the door before I even knocked. She didn't say a word, just reached out, grabbed the boxes and shut the door hard enough to rattle the frame. The first couple of runs were similar, quick drop-offs, people who barely made eye contact, doors that shut fast enough to make me feel unwelcome. Still, the money came through, cash folded inside plain envelopes left under my windshield wiper. It felt unreal, like I'd found a loophole in the system. But on the 4th delivery, things changed. Marcus texted me late in the afternoon, telling me to pick up a single package from the same strip mall parking lot. When I got there, it wasn't the blonde man waiting. It was someone new. A tall guy in a leather jacket, eyes hidden under a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't say his name. He just placed a heavier-than-usual box in my trunk and told me to head across town. The address on the card led to a duplex on a quiet street. The curtains were drawn, even though it was still daylight. I parked a little ways down, debating whether to knock or leave the box on the porch like I'd done before. Something about the silence made the hair on my arms stand up. Finally, I grabbed the box and walked up the cracked concrete steps. Before I could ring the doorbell, the front door swung open. Inside, I saw a man slumped in a chair, his shirt stained dark across the chest. The metallic smell hit me before my brain caught up with what I was looking at. Blood, soaking into the carpet beneath him. I froze in the doorway, clutching the box like a shield. Another man appeared from the kitchen, his hands smeared red. He looked right at me, then at the package, and motioned for me to set it down. My pulse pounded so hard I thought I'd pass out. The room was silent except for the faint hum of a refrigerator, the ordinary sound horribly out of place. I lowered the box onto the floor without saying a word. He crouched to pick it up, never breaking eye contact, then gestured sharply toward the door. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, and I stumbled back to my car, heart hammering against my ribs. By the time I started the engine, 2 police cruisers were turning onto the street. Their sirens weren't on yet, just the flash of blue and red lights cutting across the houses. Panic took over. If I stayed, I'd be linked to whatever nightmare I had just walked into. If I left, I risked being chased down. My instincts screamed at me to drive, so I pulled away slowly, trying not to draw attention. In the rear view, I saw officers rushing into the duplex, guns drawn. I gripped the wheel so hard my fingers ached, every part of me shaking as I tried to blend into traffic. I kept driving aimlessly for nearly an hour, looping through side streets, terrified that a police car would pull up behind me. My phone buzzed over and over with messages from Marcus, but I didn't dare open them. When I finally pulled into a gas station, I sat there shaking, replaying the scene in my head. The man in the chair, the blood, the box, it all felt like some twisted trap I had walked straight into. I didn't know if the police had seen me or if Marcus's people were tracking me, but I knew I couldn't go back to my apartment that night. My name, my address, they had everything from when I first agreed to this job. Against every instinct, I checked the messages. Marcus's tone had shifted completely. Gone was the casual recruiter. Now the texts were frantic. "Where are you? Don't talk to anyone. You need to drop the car. Now." My chest tightened with every new notification. He knew too much about me, and suddenly I realized I wasn't just a disposable driver. I was a liability. I turned my phone off, tossed it in a trash bin outside the gas station, and drove straight to my sister's place in another part of town, hoping to disappear for a while. The following morning, the news confirmed what I already feared. The duplex had been the site of a violent drug deal gone wrong. Police mentioned multiple suspects but didn't release names. There was no mention of a woman delivering a box, but that hardly gave me comfort. Every detail lined up with what I had seen, and I knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected me to it. My sister kept asking why I was so quiet, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How do you tell someone you might have been a pawn in a murder scene? I never contacted Marcus again. I changed my number, quit the diner, and moved 2 towns over within a month. Even now, years later, I still tense up when I see a package left on a porch or when a stranger tries to strike up small talk online. I don't know if the police ever pieced it together, or if Marcus's people still wonder what happened to me. What I do know is that one desperate decision nearly erased my life in a single day. It's the kind of mistake you don't get a second chance to make. I remember that night far more vividly than I want to. At the time, I was 16 and hanging around with Ryan, my best friend since middle school. We weren't exactly troublemakers, but boredom had a way of making us reckless. It was late, past the hour when most of the neighborhood shut down, and the streets were quiet enough that even the hum of the streetlights felt louder. That's when Ryan brought up the idea, half a joke at first, about daring each other to swipe something small from the corner store on Maple Street. The store itself was tiny, wedged between a laundromat and a barber shop that always smelled faintly of hair dye and cigarettes. Its front windows were cluttered with faded posters advertising sodas and scratch-off tickets. The place wasn't somewhere kids usually hung out. It was where tired adults picked up milk, cigarettes, or a six-pack after work. But to us, sneaking in and grabbing something without paying felt like the ultimate test of courage. It was stupid, I know. But at 16, stupid ideas sometimes feel like genius ones. We stood outside the glass door, the neon open sign buzzing faintly, and Ryan grinned like this was going to be the funniest thing we'd ever do. "Come on," he whispered, nudging my shoulder. "Just something small, gum, a soda. Nobody cares." I laughed, but it was the kind of laugh you give when your nerves are tangled. I didn't want to back out and look scared, so I agreed, telling myself it was just harmless fun. My heart thudded faster than it should have for something so trivial. When we stepped inside, the place smelled like dust mixed with that sharp tang of cleaning supplies. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the aisles felt narrower than usual, like the shelves were closing in. Behind the counter stood the owner, Mr. Harris. I'd seen him plenty of times before. A heavy-set man with gray stubble and a deep frown etched into his face as if it was permanent. That night, though, there was something tense about the way he leaned on the counter, his eyes flicking to us almost immediately, like he'd been waiting for someone to test him. Ryan drifted toward the aisle with chips and candy bars, acting like he was just browsing. I hung back near the coolers, pretending to read the labels on energy drinks. My palms felt clammy, and every second stretched longer than it should. I grabbed a pack of gum, slipping it into the sleeve of my hoodie. The crinkle of the wrapper sounded thunderous in the quiet store. I told myself to breathe normally, but I could sense Mr. Harris's eyes on us, sharp and unrelenting, like he knew exactly what we were up to. Ryan, always bolder than me, picked up a soda and tucked it under his jacket without hesitation. He shot me a quick glance that said, "See? Easy." He started walking casually toward the door, and that was the moment everything cracked. Mr. Harris barked, "Hey!" His voice boomed through the empty aisles, and it wasn't just angry. It carried something raw, something that came from fear as much as fury. I turned, and the sight of him made my chest tighten. He wasn't just standing there anymore. He had come out from behind the counter, and in his hand was a baseball bat, worn and splintered at the handle. His knuckles were white around it, and his eyes darted between us like we were animals cornered in his shop. "Put it back," he said, but it wasn't calm. It was the voice of someone who'd been pushed one too many times. I froze in place, gum still hidden in my sleeve, not knowing what to do. Ryan laughed nervously, trying to play it off. "Relax, man, it's just a soda," he said. But that only made it worse. Mr. Harris's face darkened and he took a step closer, raising the bat slightly like he meant business. In that second, the weight of how stupid our little dare was came crashing down on me. This wasn't a harmless prank anymore. It was a situation teetering on the edge of violence, and we were the ones who had lit the fuse. Ryan shifted like he was about to bolt for the door, but before he could move, Mr. Harris swung the bat downward, not to hit him directly but to block the way. The sound of wood smacking the linoleum floor echoed through the store like a gunshot. My throat went dry. I blurted out, "We'll put it back, okay? Just calm down." My voice cracked, and I hated how desperate it sounded. Ryan dropped the soda immediately, the can rolling across the floor until it clinked against a shelf, but Mr. Harris didn't lower the bat. His breathing was heavy, almost ragged, and he kept staring at us with this wild intensity. "You think this is a game?" he spat. "Last week someone pulled a knife on me in here. You think I'm going to wait around for it to happen again?" His words hit me harder than the sight of the bat. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified. And in that moment I realized we weren't kids messing around anymore. To him, we looked like the next threat. I raised my hand slowly, showing him the gum I had hidden, and set it on the nearest shelf. "We're done. We're leaving," I said, trying to sound steady, even though my chest felt like it was caving in. Ryan muttered an apology under his breath, his cocky grin completely gone. Mr. Harris stood there, still clutching the bat, his shoulders tense, watching every step we took toward the door. It wasn't until we were outside, the night air cold against my face, that he finally let us go without another word. We didn't run, but we walked fast, neither of us speaking until the store was a block behind us. When Ryan finally broke the silence, his voice was small, nothing like the bravado from earlier. "We could have died in there," he said. And he was right. A stupid dare had turned into something that could have ruined everything. To this day, I can't pass that store without thinking about how close we came to finding out what Mr. Harris would have done if we'd pushed him just a little further. That one night was enough to cure me of dares forever. The dashboard clock had just passed midnight when I pulled into a gas station parking lot, debating whether to call it a night. My rideshare app had been quiet for almost an hour, and the idea of going home crossed my mind more than once. That's when a man in a gray hoodie approached the car, tapping on the passenger window with the back of his knuckle. He leaned slightly so the station's fluorescent lights caught his face. Ordinary features, early 30s, short brown hair. Nothing about him screamed trouble. He asked if I was available for a cash ride. My first thought was to refuse, but my account balance and the silence of the app made me hesitate. I told him the app didn't allow off-the-record trips, but he pulled out a folded 20 and said it was only a short ride, just down to his cousin's place. His tone wasn't pushy, more like someone in a rush who didn't want to wait for another driver. I remember the way his eyes kept darting toward the lot's exit, almost as if he was timing something. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. He climbed into the back seat, resting both hands on his knees, and gave me an address I didn't recognize. It was out near the edge of town, past the part where the streetlights start to thin. At first, the drive felt routine. He talked a little, asking how long I'd been driving and whether I usually worked late nights. His voice had that monotone quality, polite enough but oddly empty, like he was rehearsing lines. About 10 minutes in, he leaned forward and said there was a faster way, something about a side road that would shave off time. I checked my GPS, which didn't show any alternate route, but he insisted the shortcut was better. I told myself people who live around here sometimes know roads that apps don't. Still, I felt my grip tighten on the steering wheel. The turn he wanted was marked by a faded wooden sign, barely visible in the headlights. The asphalt narrowed almost immediately, bordered by dense trees pressing closer than seemed possible. I glanced at the rearview mirror and caught him watching the road with an expression that didn't change. No smile, no irritation, just steady focus. The further we went, the darker it became. No houses, no mailboxes, not even the glint of another car. My gut told me the main road was safer, but he kept giving calm directions, left here, right there, as though the path was second nature. The silence on that road pressed down harder than I expected. Even the hum of my car seemed swallowed by the trees. I asked him again about the address, pretending I couldn't quite remember it, hoping he'd slip and reveal more. Instead, he repeated the same cross street and told me to just keep going. There was a shift in his tone, firmer than before, less like a request and more like a quiet command. My chest tightened, but I kept driving because the road was too narrow to turn around safely. Not long after, my headlights caught something strange. An old sedan parked crookedly against the tree line, its trunk half open like someone had been in the middle of unloading. The passenger didn't react at all, didn't even glance at it, which made the sight feel heavier. I slowed a little, heart pounding in my ears, and muttered something about hoping the road connected back to the main street soon. He didn't answer. That silence was worse than if he'd said something threatening. When the trees thinned for a moment, I noticed what looked like a clearing up ahead. He leaned forward, pointing with one finger, telling me to pull in. I stalled, pretending I hadn't heard him, but his voice cut sharper the second time. Right here, turn in. The clearing wasn't lit. No house lights, no porch glow, nothing. Just blackness broken by weeds and gravel. I could barely make out what looked like another car deeper inside. Everything in me screamed not to stop, but my options were shrinking. I slowed as if I was going to make the turn, hands slick on the wheel, then flicked my blinker toward the clearing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw his posture shift. He leaned slightly to his right like he was preparing to move. That's when I noticed the shape of his hand pressing against the side pocket of his hoodie. Not obvious, but enough for me to picture what might be inside. Every nerve in my body fired at once, telling me I had one chance to think fast before I was in that dark clearing with no witnesses. Instead of turning into the clearing, I slammed my foot on the gas and steered straight ahead. Gravel spat from the tires as the car lunged forward, bouncing hard against the uneven pavement. From the back seat he shouted something sharp, but the words blurred under the roar of the engine. He leaned forward, grabbing the headrest with one hand, and for a second I thought he'd try to yank the wheel. My focus locked on the thin strip of road ahead, refusing to glance back. The trees broke just enough to reveal another intersection, a paved road stretching left and right. My headlights caught the reflective glow of a speed limit sign, and I felt a surge of relief. Proof civilization wasn't far. I cut right without signaling, tires screeching, and the force sent him sliding against the door. He cursed, then yelled at me to slow down, but his voice cracked, losing that calm control he'd carried before. That was the first time I realized he hadn't expected me to fight back. Within minutes, houses began to appear, spaced apart but lit, porch lamps glowing like lifelines. I aimed for the first driveway with lights on and swung in without hesitation. My horn blared as I jammed it down, long and frantic, until the porch light brightened and a figure appeared at the door. That was when the man in my back seat muttered something low and pressed the handle. He slipped out before I could even stop, disappearing into the shadows between the trees as if he'd rehearsed the exit. By the time the homeowner stepped out, the man was gone. I called the police right there in the driveway, giving them every detail I could remember. They sent a car to sweep the area, but no one was found, and the sedan I'd seen earlier wasn't there when they checked. The officer who took my statement said these kinds of setups happen more often than people realize, and I shouldn't take cash fares again. Even now, years later, I think about how close I came to pulling into that clearing, how thin the line was between going home shaken and never going home at all.